Very well-known personality. I followed him as a news reporter my whole life, and he's actually a news reporter, not a news maker-upper. He reported the news as it was and told you as it was and how it was, and he went after stories and he researched stories and he told you the details of everything that went on. He's an expert on the Agnes flood, and we're hoping to have him back sometime in the future to do an Agnes flood presentation. But tonight's presentation is 110 years ago, the Titanic sank. This is the Scranton Times. I don't know if you have that, if you're going to display that. But this is the Scranton Times. This came from Walter's files. Of course, he had everything there. But this is the great Titanic sinks with 1,500 aboard. The Carpathia steaming to New York with handful of survivors of the greatest tragedy in the history of navigation. So I can pass this around, people can look at it, and I'll start in the front here, and if you can just glance at it, and then when it comes back up here. And this is something that Dave did not know anything about, but this is the memorial edition of the wreck of the Titanic. This is from the same year of the wreck of the Titanic. It has pictures of the survivors, the Carpathia. It has a list of every person who died and a list of every passenger. And just another thing out of my collection. But I can't pass it around because it's very delicate. It's very fragile. But I will put it down so that you can pass by and see it. And with that being said, I don't want to keep anybody here any longer than they have to be. And I can speak forever, and he'd never even get up here to talk. And you know, anybody who knows me knows that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. David DeCosmo, former softball player, former newscaster, former news reporter, journalist, of all kinds.
That pretty much covers it. Thank you. Can you imagine what that bottle would be worth if he hadn't drank the milk out of it? I'm just a tiny bit concerned with the venue. I belong to a church up in Mountaintop, and I have on occasion filled in for the pastor. And on the last time that I filled in for the pastor, we had an 8:30 service and a 10:30 service, and I was almost done with the 8:30 service. I was taping myself, by the way, to see if I was still good on camera. Almost done with it when I said, I'm getting that feeling again, and I collapsed. I almost instantly was awake saying, where am I? What am I doing here? Am I supposed to be speaking? I'm hearing somebody else say, call 911. No, I'm okay. I was on this, I guess for want of another term, a water pill, and it was doing horrible things to my blood pressure. And so I finished the sermon sitting down, and then the 10:30 service, they let me sit down for the whole thing. I explained to everybody. One of the guys said it was the most exciting sermon he had ever heard. So I was at least content with that.
And I forgot to mention, he's a PM.
I am a primitive Methodist, yeah. You know what that means? We don't use forks. I'm not sure if Bruce circulated this in any way, shape, or form, but I always hold this up especially for the kids, because every time I'm speaking before an elementary school group, I have to explain that I didn't actually cover the sinking. Believe it or not, it's one of the questions you get, when were you on the Titanic? I tried to tell them, no, I was on the iceberg, waiting for things to hit. The last presentation that I did, the last two I did, my 6-year-old grandson accompanied me. He's now becoming an expert on the Titanic. As a matter of fact, I will hold this up for people. This is an advertisement for the Titanic for people before they got on board. And the first thing I'll do is I'll ask the 6-year-old, Anthony, what's wrong with this picture? You'll say, Grandpa, there's smoke coming out of all 4 stacks, and one of those stacks is a fake. So that picture's not accurate. That's a 6-year-old boy, who, by the way, has a unique ambition. He wants to build a time machine and go back and warn Captain Smith. And I said, Anthony, why would he believe you? And he said, I'll take my books along with me. So pretty clever guy. I thought about doing the projection thing here, but there's so much equipment involved. I'm hoping you're able to see this so we can pass it around.
I can walk around with them.
Yeah, this is Melvina Dean. And Melvina was the last survivor of the Titanic. She was the youngest person on board. And she died at 97 in 2009, Melvina Dean. Now what's interesting was, Melvina Dean would go to Titanic presentations like this one, and she'd tell you all about the Titanic. But Melvina Dean was 2 months old when she was on the Titanic. So I'm kind of thinking that her cognitive memory at that time might have been just a little bit on the short side. She probably was remembering what her mom told her. My first experience with the Titanic came because of my dad. My dad was a motion picture projectionist. I got in the movies for free. And I remember seeing A Night to Remember. Clifton Webb and Story of the Titanic. And I remember, I guess it was my dad that I asked, is that true? This really happened. Oh my gosh. So I was always fascinated with it. Then came 1972. I was the news director of WILK in Wilkes-Barre, and I was a part-time reporter for WNEP TV. And my photographer said, David, you know there's a couple of survivors in Wilkes-Barre. I said, really? He said, yeah, one of them is Thelma Thomas. I said, do you think she'd be willing to do an interview? He said, I think she would. Now, her daughter ran a dress shop, pretty prominent dress shop in downtown Wilkes-Barre. So I contacted her, May Thomas. Would your mom do an interview? Oh, she'd be glad to. She'll do anything about the Titanic except go on a cruise. She won't do. And this is Thelma Thomas. And her story got me involved in Titanic in ways that will amaze you. Thelma did my interview with me. Now, her story was unique. Her husband had come over to Wilkes-Barre and started a produce business. He married her at 16 years of age. She was in Lebanon, and that was a common thing at that time. She had a little baby boy named Asid, and her brother-in-law, Charles Thomas, was going back to the old country for a wedding, ironically. And Mr. Thomas said, when you're going back, would you please bring my wife and my infant son back with you? And obviously he said, sure, I will do that. So Charles goes to England. Eventually he meets up with Thelma and the little baby. But the passage back is on the Titanic. Well, you know the story. It hits the iceberg. Initially, no one thought there was really any danger. You know, it was called an unsinkable ship. Not by the promoters of the ship so much as just people who knew how very large it was. It was the largest ship at the time. It was one of 3 being built at the same time. The Olympic, which was launched first, the Titanic, and the 3rd ship was going to be the Gigantic. And I'm going to tell you more about the 3rd ship in a little while. In any case, Charles is holding the baby, trying to get through the crowd with Thelma at his side. She becomes separated. Someone actually pulled her into a lifeboat, and she's screaming, my baby, my baby. But she doesn't speak English. No one knows what she's yelling. So for 2 days, she thought that her brother-in-law and little Asid died in the sinking. Now, when she got to a hospital in New York City, she was told that there were children who had survived and they were in another ward. And sure enough, she goes over to the other ward and there's her baby. Unfortunately, Charles did die when the ship went down. But he handed the baby to a woman in another lifeboat. I don't think you need this one, but we'll get to him though.
We can lay them
Her-
out here and they can walk up
Oh,
and
that's
look at them
true.
later. if you
Her
want.
story. My only problem with it was she had a thick accent. So, you know, for radio and TV, you're trying to make sure it's understandable. And she was, but it was a little difficult. She remembered the band playing till right to the end. Then she remembered the horrible screaming, dying down in the water as people died, drowning, hypothermia. The water was less than 32 degrees because it was salt water, it was not frozen. Life expectancy was probably about 15 minutes, unless you were the cook and were loaded with alcohol, in which case you were able to swim to something, hold on to it, and believe it or not, you survived. What a story though. And we recorded this a couple days in advance of the actual anniversary. You can pick one of 2 days. The Titanic hit the iceberg late in the evening of April the 14th, 1912. It sank in the early morning hours of April 15th. Well, we're saving the interview, both for radio and TV, for the 15th. On that day, I'm watching the Today Show in New York, and they had this woman on, Mrs. Edwina Trout Mackenzie. Now, Mrs. Mackenzie was English and admittedly a lot easier to understand. But what story is she telling? She remembers the band playing till right near the end. And she remembers the horrible screaming, dying down to nothing. And I said, I've got the same story as NBC. And it was the same story with one exception. While she was in a lifeboat, somebody handed her a baby. I saw your expression. It's mine yet. My chills are here, and the tears are just right at the edge. And it never changes, not since 1972. Every time I tell the story. I got on the telephone and I called NBC in New York. And I said, I don't know what the odds are, but you had a woman who was handed a baby, and I had a woman whose baby was handed. The associate producer at NBC got Mrs. Mackenzie on the phone with Mrs. Thomas. Mrs. Mackenzie remembered the blanket. She had saved that boy on the Titanic. These two people never met. They corresponded by telephone, postcard, Christmas card, but Mrs. Thomas died in '74, and she never got to meet her in person. One of her daughters, not the one from Wilkes-Barre, but one from Ohio, did get to meet Mrs. Mackenzie. The whereabouts of the blanket is still a mystery. Mrs. Thomas's daughter, May, who frequently did these presentations with myself and another fellow, passed away last year. And she had the blanket at one time, and she said it disappeared from her home. She thought one of the relatives had it, but nobody has admitted to it, and it's gone. This is the only picture of the child, and obviously he is not a baby in this picture. This is Acid Thomas. Acid lived to be 21 and died of tuberculosis at the Whitehaven Center. And alas, he and his mom are finally reunited in eternity. Well, now I've become a nut on Titanic. Everything I see in Titanic, I'm mystified by it. I got a book, I get all kinds of books. My grandkids give me books all the time. And I read about this lady, Mrs. Mubarak, who's headed for Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, aboard the Titanic. I never heard of her. Now, Thelma Thomas has died now, so I called her daughter, and I said, May, who is this Mrs. Mubarak? She said, oh, that's my grandmother. They changed their name to Borak when they got here. This is Mrs. Borak. Mrs. Borak was on board the Titanic with her two sons, who, thanks to a telephone call I made last night, I finally positively identified which is which. This is William, and this is George. Now, her story is strangely similar in some ways to Mrs. Thomas, in that she was in the old country, and there was a fellow named Anton Yezbek. And Anton was going to Lebanon to marry Selina. Selina was Mrs. Mubarak's sister. So Anton is going to bring his bride and his sister-in-law and the two children to the United States. Once again, they're on board the Titanic. Mr. Yazbek is now a newlywed, putting his wife in a lifeboat, and she leans to kiss him goodbye. And a shot is fired, not at him, but in the air. Women and children only. So Mr. Yazbek didn't get in the boat. This is that boat. Pass this around if you will, Bruce. This is collapsible sea. When you look at this photo, you will notice on the side of the boat some strange lines. This is not a wooden boat. This is literally a collapsible boat, folds down flat, and you pull up the sides and wrench it, and you have an extra lifeboat. Now, Mrs. Mubarak and her two boys and Mrs. Yazbek are now in collapsible sea. Mr. Yazbek didn't get in, and he died. But guess who did get in? Bruce Ismay, the president of the White Star Line. The man that many said ordered full speed ahead on the Titanic, even through ice fields. He was villainized through the rest of his life for getting in that lifeboat, saving himself when many others did not. There's some school of thought in his defense that he didn't get in right when Mr. Yazbek was trying to get in, that it was a different time, and that maybe he was setting an example like, yes, we must use the lifeboats. You can make your own decision on that. I think I'm going to go with the crowd. I don't think you should have been in the lifeboat. Especially when other people didn't get in the lifeboat. Any movie you see about the Titanic, you will see these two people. This is Isidore and Ida Strauss. If you don't know Isidore, you may have heard of a little store he started called Macy's. Mrs. Strauss was being taken to a lifeboat with him at her side, and she said, "We have been together many years. I will not leave him now." And this was overheard. This is a quote. This is not something made up for the movies. She said this, and she perished along with him. And most people know the story of the Strausses. But I will wager that most of you don't know anything about William and Delia Loeb. And I can't tell you too much about them. I can show you a photo of their home at 1711 Swetland Street in Scranton. Mr. Loeb and they were married, they're from England, they were married and they came to Scranton, where he became an engineer with the Lackawanna Railroad. His brother back in England passed away. And they couldn't make it back for the funeral, but they did want to make it back for a memorial service. So William and his wife went back to England for the memorial service for his brother, and then boarded the Titanic. The Titanic, as you may or may not know, made a stop before it headed out to sea in Ireland. As a matter of fact, you'll see video of the Titanic shot by an Irish priest who was on the segment of the trip from England to Ireland. And that video is available. It shows the ship sailing, shows Captain Smith, shows the decks. And when they were coming back to the United States aboard the Titanic, Delia Loeb sent the postcard back to the family and said, "This is the biggest ship afloat. We are well." Signed, Delia. Well, Delia refused to leave her husband. Same as Mrs. Strauss. They both perished. Delia's body was recovered but not immediately identified. And so I believe that she was buried at sea. There is a memorial stone, however, to them, which is in a cemetery in Dalton, to both of them. Now, it's important that you know a little bit about the recovery. After the Titanic went down, the White Star Line employed a cable laying ship. Remember, you had cable communications, you know, Morse code, etc., from the United States to England and Ireland, etc., through cables that are literally laying in the bottom of the ocean. One of the ships that laid those cables was the Mackie Bennett. And the Mackie Bennett was contracted to do a very unpleasant job. It was contracted to go out and pick up as many bodies as they could get from the waters where the Titanic went down. And there were plenty of bodies out there. If there was any chance of identifying that body, if they thought there was a pretty decent chance, they would bring the body back and try to look over the evidence and see what they could find out. Some bodies were too deteriorated to be able to identify. A priest and a minister was on board the Mackie Bennett, and they would have a service and bury those people at sea. In the case of Delia Loeb, while she was buried at sea, her jewelry was recovered, and that jewelry was later identified as being hers. His body was never recovered. By the way, the body of Charles Thomas was never recovered either. As each body was found, it was given a number in a logbook, body 1, body 2, body 3, etc. Either the third or the sixth body that was found, and this one I've got to go back and check on, was that of a little infant. And the crew of the Mackie Bennett was driven to tears. And they said, if this body is not identified, we would like to put up a memorial. And so the memorial, the most visited memorial in the cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, is that of the unknown child, erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic, April 15th, 1912. Now, as the 1960s and 1970s came along, something called DNA evidence began to be used. And there were people who said, you know, I had relatives on the Titanic. One of them was a little child. I wonder. And then there were a couple others that said, you know, I have relatives and we think this could. 3 graves were exhumed. One of them was the grave of the unknown child, where some fragments of bone were found bearing DNA. And so the process was started in trying to see whether or not they could identify the unknown child of the Titanic. And during the initial stages of, I'll pass this one around, Bruce, of checking things out, they came up with some preliminary evidence that suggested that the unknown child was actually a little boy from Sweden, last name being Penula. And they invited the Penula family over, and they had a service at this gravesite. And the family said, you know, but let the grave as is, representing all the children, some 50 or more children who died when the Titanic sank. And that was, you know, that was impressive and everything, except the DNA technology took leaps and bounds ahead. And all of a sudden, some of the people doing the research said, wait a minute, we match at this level, but we'll get to this level, it doesn't match. And they brought the Army in, and was doing some really fantastic things with the DNA evidence. They made a mistake. It wasn't the Penula child. It was a fellow named Sidney Leslie Goodwin of England. And that now is a positive identification. This is the little baby who's buried in the grave of the unknown child. Like the Penulas, this family came over and said, let the grave remain as it is, as a memorial to all of the children who lost their lives aboard the Titanic. And so now they know Sidney Leslie Goodwin is the child who's in the grave, but again, the tombstone stands as a recognition to all children. It is the most visited grave of all of them in the Halifax Cemetery. This is the second most visited grave. How many have seen the latest movie, Titanic? Anybody? Anybody remember a fellow named Jack Dawson? Leonardo DiCaprio? This is the grave of Jay Dawson. And a lot of young women leave flowers and ticket stubs at this grave. Now, unfortunately, it's not Jack Dawson. Because Jack Dawson is a fictional character. This is Joseph Dawson, who worked in the engine room on the Titanic. But the grave just says J. Dawson. And consequently, these younger women tend to leave the flowers and the ticket stubs there. So that will probably die down a bit as the movie gets older. As you know, the movie's now, what's the movie now, 20 years old or something? And now there's a big debate as to whether or not Jack could have also got on that big board. And you know, the producer says, no, he couldn't. He had to die. That's the story. That's the way the story's got to play out. But it's kind of amazing. Please excuse me, the pollen, the flowers are beautiful, but the pollen is killing them.
I think they're fake. I think they're plastic.
It's not those, it's the ones out there. Hey kids, you ever see Willy Wonka? The golden ticket? It's a golden ticket to Titanic. It's accurate, it's true. Only it's not a ticket, it's a down payment for a ticket. But the fellow who got the ticket got called back home early. And consequently, Milton Hershey didn't go on the Titanic. Had he gone, chances are Hershey Kisses and Hershey bars might not exist today. You can see the actual ticket at the Hershey Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania, but this is a replica of that ticket. Now, remember I told you in the beginning about 3 ships that were coming out at the same time. And the first was the Olympic. A lot of people don't know that as the Olympic was sailing on one of its voyages, it was accidentally rammed by a British warship. And it had a hole in it as big as the hole that hit the Titanic, but not as long. And no one died, which was a very good piece of news for Violet Jessup, because Violet Jessup was a stewardess on the Olympic. Then she went to her second job on the Titanic, where she was a stewardess. And she survived. And she went to her third job. The Gigantic didn't seem like a name they should call the new ship after Titanic went down, so they renamed it the Britannic. And unfortunately, during the war, the Britannic hit a mine in the ocean and sank. Violet Jessup was on board, and she survived.
Wow.
And Violet Jessup was on all 3 Titanic-class ships and survived each of those instances. The Titanic was the largest ship at the time. If any of you have gone on a cruise, you've been on a ship far bigger than Titanic. They're all way bigger than Titanic now, but it was advertised as the biggest of its kind. It costs at the time, let's see, first class parlor, equivalent in today's dollars, if you wanted a first class parlor, $100,000 in today's money. If you wanted a berth in first class, not the suite, $3,500. If you wanted a berth in second class, $1,375. Now, what did people make then? $400 a year, $500 a year, maybe if they were wealthy. Third class, you could get in there for anywhere from $350 to $900 in today's dollars. So it was expensive. No matter what class you might have been sailing, the Titanic was an expensive proposition. I told you that I get books on Titanic all the time. You may have that one. I had one also in 1912 that was lent to me, and I had to give it back to the friend of the person who lent it to me after the person lent it to me passed away.
I might have the blanket in my house.
Maybe that's it. I don't know. Here's another area resident, and this is something I just got, I think last year. Anna McGowan. Anna McGowan was born in Scranton, and she boarded the Titanic in Queenstown as a third-class passenger. She survived. She said, they just grabbed me the way I was, wearing just a dress and shoes. They would not even let me take my purse. Anna recalled, I was just numb, and it was so cold out on the ocean. She also remembered the band playing. She added that the band was playing Nearer My God to Thee. The band that played right till the end, the leader of that band was Wallace Hartley. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered, as was his violin, inside its case, and very well preserved. They went through a lot of studies to make sure it was the right violin. Wallace had a fiancée who had a little plaque put on his violin, and that became the ultimate evidence that they had the right instrument. And it sold 2 years ago for $1.78 million. That's a sweet tune. So right before, at the 100th anniversary, Bill Lewis is a historian from Wilkes-Barre, and Bill has done a little booklet on all the people bound for Wilkes-Barre who were on the Titanic. And he and May Thomas and I did a presentation for the 100th anniversary in the Westmoreland Club in Wilkes-Barre, which is a big plush club. They were so crowded, they had to open a room outside and pipe in our speech. And I said to Bill, after we're all done and I tell my story and May tells hers and you tell yours, I said, can I go last? Because I've come across something new. My grandson Ryan, who's my middle grandson, gave me a book, and unlike all the others, it had 4 telegrams sent from survivors on the Carpathia back to relatives. And this can give you a little idea as to what people were thinking at that time, because it was a different era. I'm very old school. Ladies, if that gets you edgy, please forgive me. My wife doesn't get in the car until I've opened the door for her and closed it after she's in. My dad taught me that. I do it, and that's the way it is, as Walter Cronkite would say. This is one of the telegrams. This is from a young lady. Just another line to say, I am very well and getting quite used to things now. I escaped in my nightdress and coat and petticoats. Everything else has gone. We are sleeping like a lot of dead things all over the floors of the ship. Let me explain that. When the Carpathia picked up the Titanic survivors, it was loaded with passengers. So it didn't have lots of extra rooms and lots of extra space. Fortunately, the compassionate people on the Carpathia, the passengers, made room for these 715 survivors to be, so it wasn't like Rose sitting out on the deck, like when her husband or her would-be husband was trying to find her. So that's why she said, we're sleeping like a lot of dead things all over the floors of the ship. They're using all the space they could. I dare say you all have lots of sympathy for me, but believe me, I am one of the lucky ones. My life is saved, my health is not impaired, and I have not lost anyone belonging to me. I tell you, I have lots to be thankful for. I was ready to go down with the ship, but they forced me into a lifeboat. I think it wicked to save the single girls. But now that I have saved a baby whose mother was in another boat, I don't mind. This was a telegram from Edwina Trout Mackenzie, the woman who saved Mrs. Thomas's baby. No one had heard that until the 100th anniversary presentation at the Westmoreland Club, and there was not a dry eye in the house, including Mae Thomas, who was hearing this for the very first time about her brother. It's just amazing. My grandson gave me that book 2 days before that get-together. And I'm skimming through it now. Every time I get a book on Titanic, first thing in my mind is, it sinks. I know the ending. I mean, that part was not a surprise. But here I see these things, and this amazes me. It's just the stories that they keep coming up. It wasn't until 10 years ago, maybe 11 now, that we found out, because they released documents, all this big story. Ballard wants to find the Titanic. Yeah, he wanted to find the Titanic. He definitely did. But he needed a submersible. And the only person that had the submersible, the only agency that he could use, was the Navy. And the Navy said to him, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go out and you're going to find the remains of the atomic submarine Thresher and Scorpion, which sunk unexpectedly. Going to film those remains, get all the information you can for us on those, and any time you have left after that, within this time period, you can find the Titanic. So he had a very limited amount. He just had a few days. He found both of those submarines. Then he found the Titanic. But the cover story had to be the Titanic, because we didn't want either the Russians or the Chinese to know that we were scattering the ocean bottom to find the remnants of those submarines. And again, he was successful. He found them both. So, but this is information we still are finding more and more things about the Titanic. And you think about the story. Let's go over the story. We have a brand new ship. It's called Unsinkable. It had 3 propellers, one in the center, 2 in the sides. It had 2 fuel lifeboats. It hits an iceberg on the starboard side on an April night, about 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. You know what ship I'm talking about? This was in a book that was published in 1898 by Morgan Robertson. The book was called Futility. The name of the ship in his book was the Titan. Wow. That ought to give you chills.
Yeah.
Just absolutely amazing. I kind of pretty much covered what I wanted to. I'll answer any questions that I can answer. I'm really not an expert. I'm knowledgeable in a few of the fields around this and a few of the things that deal with local people. I'm finding out more all the time. I had to call the granddaughter of Mrs. Mubarak the other night because I said, hey, I've got pictures of both the boys. Which is which? And she said, well, one looks older. I said, well, I can't tell. One has a light tie, one has a dark tie. That's what But remember that we lost the last survivor in 2009. So you're getting 2nd generation and 3rd generation stories. It's important, and whether it's the Titanic, whether it's a railroad station in town, whether it's postcards of buildings that did exist and are no longer here, these are vital parts of your history. And I'm so glad to see a couple of youngsters here. And they may be picking up just a little bit of what I'm offering. I understand that. I put all this gray in my hair. It costs a lot of money. I get that in there. But it's important that they know these things. I do a daily blog, and I happen to do one on the Knox mine disaster. I said, how many schools teach about the Knox mine disaster? I don't mean to do a semester on it. I mean to do a class one day. That destroyed coal mining in the lower, in Luzerne County. And below, one mine to another. But they don't remember these things. And they're important. History is very important. And history, kids, when you're in school, keep in mind, history is stories. Who doesn't like a story? And I tell stories all the time. Some of them are actually true. But I think it's important that young people get some indoctrination into things like this. And as we go on, look, I'm going to be 80 in September. How many more years do I have to tell my link with Titanic, where I was actually in the company of and met a survivor? You know, it's not going to be too many more years. Now, fortunately, I'll be on videotape forever. So I suppose you can rely on that. Is there would anybody have any question that I might be able to address? I cover things so thoroughly, it's not usual I get questions, but I try to cover it that way. And I didn't fall down or anything. This is good. I could lead you in the doxology. Yes?
Could they have taken some of the people in the lifeboat and taken them over and sat them on the iceberg and then come back again?
Nobody ever thought of it. Nobody ever thought of maybe going, because the iceberg was still close by. Nobody ever thought of the possibility, because you're reacting immediately. Nobody ever thought of the possibility that if you rammed that iceberg head on, you'd damage the ship, but you wouldn't sink it. You tried to turn. And they cleared what they could see of the iceberg. But the bulk of the iceberg is underwater. And that's what crushed into the side. There's all kinds of theories now, too, about other things. There was a coal fire on the Titanic. As they sailed, there was one of their coal bins was burning. And there's a theory that, that could have weakened the metal in that particular area. That's one of the things. Another thing you have to realize is the Titanic is disintegrating. It, like me, is not going to be there forever. The elements of sea are eating away at it. The very last project proposed for the Titanic was proposed right before COVID hit. There was a firm that wanted to go down and get the radio set on which the distress signal was called. They believe they have an open area where they can get down and get it. Now you hit the controversy. There are those who say the Titanic is a grave site and should not be touched. Ballard, by the way, subscribes to that theory. There are others who say there are parts of history there that should be preserved. The Titanic was not the first ship to send out an SOS. It sent out initially a distress call called CQD. CQ was the code for anybody, D was the code for distress. But they did try to send the SOS. We all know now there was another ship close by within sight. It was the Californian. The radio operator in the California, probably right before it hit the iceberg, tried to call through to the Titanic. They were so busy sending cables out, they literally said, shut up, we're broadcasting. So he went to sleep. They didn't have to have a full-time radio operator on. Had he been at his station, conceivably, almost everybody on board could have been saved. We have to assume that some were killed in the lower areas of the ship when it rammed and when the water started to pour in. Bruce, when he introduced me, and I always like to bring this up, talked about, ask the kids, what's the worst sea disaster ever? And you're going to hear people say the Titanic. It's not. 1,500 people died when the Titanic sank. At the end of World War II, now let me back up just a little before then. Before World War II, the Germans built a gigantic passenger ship. It was supposed to be called the Adolf Hitler. But in Sweden, a young Jewish boy assassinated the Swedish head of the Nazi party, Wilhelm Gustaf. And Hitler saw the opportunity to have some propaganda. Let's immortalize this Swedish ambassador and name the ship the Wilhelm Gustaf. At the end of World War II, the Wilhelm Gustaf was sailing across the Baltic with soldiers, with people trying to escape what war they could escape and everything. And a Russian submarine spotted the ship. Has anybody ever here, other than you, of course, with the taping, anybody here ever heard of the William Gustaf? Anybody at all? You have. Okay. When I told you that. We know, and you can go online and see, the words that were written on the 3 Russian torpedoes that sank that ship. That information is available. And with that ship, between 9,400 and 10,000 people died. 10,000 people. Titanic was 1,500. But nobody knows about the Wilhelm Gustaf. When I first heard about it, why? Why don't we know about this? It was at the end of World War II. Everyone who died on that ship was German. Nobody liked the Germans back then, especially at the end of the war. By then they were hated by virtually everybody, including other Germans who tried to assassinate Hitler. The Russian captain who sank the ship was a drunkard. And the Russian government did not want to promote him in any way, shape, or form. But if you go online and look at the Wilhelm Gustaf, you will have a ton of information available to you. But it's amazing, people don't know about it. I thank you so much for your courtesy and for your attention. It's such a pleasure to have been here to share some of this with you, and I look forward to come back on another occasion with another story. Unfortunately, I have gathered a few true ones, so thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Did the Titanic sink by Ballard?
There was that?
Did it sink by Ballard or under the ship or attracted?
I'm not hearing well.
I can't hear him either.
I'm not getting it.
Is the Titanic?
Come on up. Come on.
Hear what we can hear.
When you get old like me, your hearing goes. Okay, now,
Did the Titanic sink by a V-break or a regular?
did the Titanic sink?
V-break.
Well, it broke in half, you know that. It did break in half. And you know something? It's kind of amazing that he asked this question. There were 2 hearings after the Titanic sunk, one in Washington and one in England. And passengers said they saw the ship break in half. And yet, when Ballard found it, people were surprised that it was found in 2 halves. There was even one fictional book written, Raise the Titanic, and when envisioned bringing the whole thing up that way. It's broken in half. The rear section is almost totally destroyed now because it collapsed upon itself already. The front section, there's still some depth to it. You can still get in with cameras. If you were to go down, and you can, all you have to do is have your mom and dad give you about $10,000. There's a group that are taking people down. Somebody asked me if I wanted to see it. I said no. I don't know. It's spooky to me. And I guess it shouldn't be, but it is. I wouldn't want to go down and look at it, but they are taking people down. And one of the first things you see, keep in mind, this is total blackness down there. They have to put on these gigantic spotlights from the submarines. And one of the first things you see on the deck is little plaques from different people that have gone down in submarines and left little memorials on the deck, which of course were not there when it went down.
Yeah, I heard it takes a couple days to get down there.
No, you probably go down in about 3 hours. But they have to go down slowly and they have to come back. But they're in pressurized vessels, so they can go down. You're a sharp young fella. You're going to know more about the Titanic. Not after tonight, but after most of us are gone, you're still going to be finding new things about Titanic. And maybe you'll tell somebody, and I remember when that old guy was at that church in German, and he told me about the Titanic. I hope you do remember that. Thank you, sir. Thanks again, everybody.